Exploring societal challenges through the lens of civic science. This is the Local Perspectives program with host Diya Dwarakanath.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Diya Dwarakanath. Today, we're discussing how community-led science can help with wildfire management and natural resource conservation. We have the pleasure of being joined by Rachael Cleveland, a natural resource specialist and environmental scientist in local government. Ms. Cleveland previously studied at the University of Hawai'i at Mānoa, where she received her master's degree and published a participatory science and decision-making study we'll be discussing. Welcome, Rachael.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, let's connect the dots. Tell us about your study. What societal issue does it hope to tackle?
Yeah, well, so the biggest thing was I want to say my first semester of grad school, I read this paper. We all read it, my whole cohort. It was talking about how a lot of research being done just doesn't actually end up getting applied. And I went to grad school because I was really interested in the human connection or the human dimensions of conservation. And so I found it really fascinating that we were doing all of this really great work, but it wasn't actually shown to be applied in actual management all that often. And so that really got me thinking about how do we get communities involved in the work that we do to help make it more relevant and something that can actually be applied to the real world. And so I was studying in Hawaii, and my lab was focused on wildfires. And the unique thing about Hawaii is that wildfires are not naturally occurring, really. They are mostly caused by invasive species and like human impacts. And so my research lab was connected with this local community group called the Wai'nai Fire Hui. And it was a group of land managers that were really interested in how to manage their landscape for wildfire. And so when I got involved with my master's and having read that paper, I was really interested in how getting the community involved could impact wildfire management in Hawaii.
Okay. And so you already had that connection with the Wai'nai Fire Hui group through your research lab.
Yes, that's correct. So so my research lab had two principal investigators, and so one of them was already pretty involved in the group. The group's facilitated by a local nonprofit, and so he was able to get me connected to those two facilitators, and that's when we started chatting about how I could do a research project that would also benefit the group.
Okay. And tell us about the Fire Hui community group. Did their demographics represent the overall demographics of Wai'nai?
Yeah, I would say so. Wai'nai has a very heavy agriculture based population. A lot of the land use there is agricultural based, and the group itself is made up of a lot of local farmers and ranchers. And then there's also a nice mix of scientific communicators and teachers, as well as there were groups from the university that I went to, UH Mānoa, and different state departments were also involved. So local government was involved in that too. So yeah, I would say it was pretty representative of the community there.
Okay, that's good to hear. And in terms of the kind of racial demographics as well, was it representative of the different, indigenous and different communities that are also on the island?
Yeah. So while my research part of my research was not asking for race when I was talking to the participants, but from what I know about the group, I would say yes, Native Hawaiians and indigenous folks were represented in the Fire Hui for sure.
Okay. And so, like, with this community group, it sounded like you already had an idea to do some research where you're working with them. So how did you kind of come up with the topic that you did? Can you tell us? Let's dive deeper into your study. I've read it and looked over it, but for our audience, if you want to give us an overview of what the study was doing, how you went about it.
Yeah, so the grant that we received, really, it just needed to be focused vaguely on forests and land management, and that was kind of it. So it was really broad. And so actually, initially, I was going to do a completely different research study, but then when the pandemic hit, we kind of really shifted gears, and my other PI was really interested in decision making, and she knew that I was interested in those human dimensions of conservation. And so we kind of put our heads together and was like, oh yeah, like a decision making research study would be really interesting. And then we knew that the Fire Hui was gearing up to figure out how they were going to manage their land. So they had a decision that basically needed to be made, because again, a lot of the Hui members were are landowners. And so they were concerned about wildfire risk and what they could do to their landscape to help manage for that risk. And so it kind of just was a little serendipitous, if you will, because it really just worked out well in that I was interested in this decision-making framework, and then those folks had a decision to be made. And so it just worked out really well that I was able to take this structured decision-making framework and apply it to this group. And then I want to say the fuzzy cognitive mapping just I came across it along the way of trying to figure out how we were going to do modeling without intense quantitative models. And so, yeah, it just kind of all came together in that way. It really worked out well. And thankfully, the facilitators that I mentioned previously from the nonprofit that helps manage the Hui, they were just really open and excited for the possibility of getting to do research that would benefit the community. So we were able to just work together to find something that would be interesting for me as a student, but then also really beneficial to the group.
Okay. And for the study, what was the decision that the community was trying to make? And how can you tell us a little about the structured decision making? What is that process? And, for those of us scientists in the audience who may not have heard of it or be aware of it, how did it help in this particular decision?
Yeah, so basically the group wanted to know what different land management practices could they do that would help prevent wildfire risk. And then we were also curious of how that impacted other things that the group cared about. And so what structured decision making is, it's a decision making framework where you essentially take objectives and then you figure out, like, once you establish your objectives, you figure out, well, what are your different options that you can do to reach those objectives? And then you attempt to model how those options impact the objectives. And it's basically this one big cycle that a group can go through to help make a decision. And so, yeah, there's key stages. There's defining the problem, defining the objectives, defining the actions that you can take, then the consequences, and then the final step would be the trade-offs. So essentially, once you've modeled the different consequences that could happen, then you make your decision by determining, what are the pros, what are the cons of each decision, and then you can get to a decision from there.
Okay. And I understand that there were, if we get into the details of it, I think in this case, what were the key objectives and the actions that could be taken?
Yeah, so what I first did was I did individual interviews with 14 of the Fire Hui members. And when I did those interviews, what I really wanted to get down to were the problem statements, those objectives, and then the potential actions that they saw as possibilities to do. And so with those objectives, I wanted to understand what they cared about the landscape. We want to reduce wildfire risk, but usually that's not the underlying objective. It's not that we don't like wildfire per se. It's those the things that the wildfire causes that we want to get at. And so I was kind of looking at it through a lens of ecosystem services. So I was curious, what different things about the landscape did these landowners want to conserve or protect against wildfire risk? And so in doing these different interviews, basically 3 major ecosystem services were consistently coming up again and again and again. And that's where I got that biodiversity, the water resources, and then the spiritual experience. And while those aren't those are kind of broad for ecosystem services, but I thought that those captured the essence of what people were concerned about for the purposes of that wildfire management.
Okay. And in a process like this, how do you make sure things don't get lost in translation and in these big, complex, open-ended questions and answers in your interview? Did you kind of go back and check with the members after interviewing whether those three were the right um, services and objectives to get out of the process?
So one of the cool things is that because we had science communicators and teachers and folks from local government there too, I was maybe not surprised is the right word, but I was pleasantly surprised that it was actually quite easy to talk to folks about these different ecosystem services. I didn't necessarily use that word per se, but lots of folks brought up biodiversity pretty explicitly. Like other times it was like, oh, talking about the native species and the plants and animals. And so I did my best to try to piece out what they were getting at from their responses. And so it did take a lot of reviewing the transcripts after the interviews, as well as just during the interviews themselves. If it was ever a point of confusion, I would just double check with them and make sure that I was understanding them correctly. So yeah, the interviews kind of go, you have a set idea of which questions you're going to ask, but then, they're kind of like going on a hike. There's like little offshoots and turns that you take during that process to make sure you're getting at the right, make sure you're understanding them and that they're understanding you as well.
Got it. Got it. And like what you mentioned, one of the things that surprised you was what was kind of using the term biodiversity, and that understanding was already there among the community members. What else surprised you, and what did you kind of learn from your work?
I mean, if you've ever been to Hawaii or the culture there, that there's this deep connection to place. And I had lived there for a little while before choosing to go to grad school there. So I was aware of that, and I had done conservation work in Hawaii before. But even still, talking to them, to the landowners in particular, and just hearing how deeply connected they were to place and how deep their love for the land was, and just how much they wanted to care for it, was just like a really joyful experience for me, I suppose. It was really, that's why I included quotes in my paper, because I just couldn't not, because everyone spoke so eloquently, and it was just, I wanted to try to capture that magic of how they spoke about the place that they wanted to care for.
I see. I saw that in there, and the quotes definitely do add to it. And so from this work you did, was it your first community science or participatory science research project?
For the most part, yes. So I had done a research project as an undergrad, and that really wasn't community-based at all. It was biogeochemistry, having to do with mercury pollution. So that really didn't have a community component at all. But while I was going to grad school, and for a year before, I was working for an urban forestry nonprofit in Hawaii. And they had, the main program that I worked with was the citizen science program called the Citizen Foresters. And basically I helped recruit volunteers and train them to be able to collect urban tree forest data. And so in that was like totally community participatory. It just wasn't inherently a research setting. We were just data collectors at that point. We weren't really, we were trying to establish a big database that then could be used for things like that. But we ourselves were not the ones doing the data analysis per se.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you had a little bit of experience in different ways of doing community science. And so what actionable advice would you give to others doing natural resource management work and wanting to involve the community?
Yeah, so I think that's where picking your university and your principal investigators is really critical, because a lot of times the structure is, you have a grant, you have to do this work, you're doing this research, and you have to be able to follow the stipulations of that grant or of the research that's maybe already established in your lab. And so when you're coming on as a student, sometimes you're kind of just told what to do. It's not always as open-ended as I was afforded. And so I would say, because of that inflexibility, I think having the support of my university and my program to make my research what I wanted it to be, and they were very well established and connected in the local community, and saw and valued how important that was, I was able to then have the ability and be allowed to do this community-based research. And I'm not sure that every situation would have allowed for that. So I think really setting yourself up for success is to ensure that the program that you're participating in, or the research lab that you're participating in, sees the value of engaging with the community. And that takes away, like, I would say, at least half the barriers right there of just being afforded that flexibility.
Interesting. And what is different about the way the lab is maybe structured, or the way they approach things, if you've observed anything or can comment on that makes it possible to do this work?
Yeah, so I mean, I've only done one grad school program, so I can't speak to all the other programs. I mean, I'm sure there's a bunch of others out there that are also encouraging of this work, but it was really just my first semester in grad school where we were learning about that disconnect between research and application, and how important it is to have the community involved. That's what really set my mind on even thinking about that sort of thing, and that's what really allowed me to feel comfortable trying to do that. And so my whole department really encouraged as much as we could to do projects that were projects or research, depending on which program you were in, to make that happen, to make that community connection. They just that was really valued by my program, and so it allowed me to do that. Whereas again, depending on the grant or depending on the research lab that you're in, that flexibility might just not be there for you.
Okay. And I'm curious, did you have a chance to visit Wai'nai when you did this?
Sadly, no. Unfortunately, right as I was starting the research, the pandemic, COVID-19, had happened. And so we were doing everything through Zoom. Interestingly enough, the nonprofit and the two facilitators are both based on the Big Island of Hawaii, and Wai'nai is on Oahu, so different islands. And so I've actually never met in person the facilitators from the nonprofit that was involved in the Hui. And so yeah, I have met my principal investigators. They were my advisors for my program in person, but I haven't actually met anyone from my research in person, because it was all during the pandemic.
Okay. And did that hinder things in any way?
I definitely think so. In particular, and I mentioned this in my paper, but the workshops, which was like the second step of my research, was very challenging to get folks interested in participating and just coordinating schedules and everything like that. And so that definitely limited participation for sure. And I think in another step, you're making this fuzzy cognitive map, and it's a really collaborative process. And so I can't help but imagine that it would have been much improved had we been able to like have it on a whiteboard and be able to like adjust things ourselves and have it be kind of a half day affair rather than just a 1 hour Zoom call. It was great to be able to talk to folks and have everyone participating, even if some of them were spread out, but it certainly there's something lost there that I think we've all learned in doing stuff online or virtually for those like 2 or 3 years. So I wish we could have done it in person, but sometimes it just doesn't work out that way.
That's fair. And what is fuzzy cognitive mapping, really briefly, if you can explain that term?
Yeah, so it's basically a process to take the internal knowledge that you have and turn it into what's basically a flow chart that lets you visually see that knowledge. And it's really focused on like systems. So it's focused on how two variables interact with each other. Like, does one increase the other? Does one decrease the other? Does it not at all? So it's kind of like a systems approach, but it's often used for like expert knowledge. So like what a scientist how they might view a wetland, for example. And it's basically the semi-quantitative way to capture that knowledge and model it in a way that you can then not ask it questions, but like you can see how it impacts a system.
Okay. And is that a commonly used tool for land management and natural resource management?
Yeah, so in the background research that I had to do, in the literature reviews and all of that, it's definitely been used in other natural resource problems before. It was unique to my paper of merging the two together, structured decision making and fuzzy cognitive mapping. So that was something novel, a novel approach that we were doing to try to see how the tool fuzzy cognitive mapping worked with the structured decision making framework. And then, as noted in my paper, shortly before publication, I was actually able to come across a different paper that had used those two methods to do as well for a natural resource problem. I want to say it was like a fisheries problem. And so I think that speaks to how other people are recognizing that these might be two processes that work well together.
Okay. And I understand that from the different objectives of biodiversity and water quality, there were some actions that you had decided might be helpful. And just from the paper I recall, there was grazing, native species outplanting, and herbicide use that were some of the actions that to manage the process. So from all of this, the next step was then to decide which action to take. So did the Fire Hui group implement any actions post study?
Yeah, so I have been able to keep in contact with the group on occasion, and I do know that they have been experimenting with grazing. There's a landowner who was particularly interested in grazing, and so they've started doing that for sure. And I do believe some of the other landowners have done native species outplanting as well.
Okay. And what unanswered questions do you still have after conducting this study? And what are some of the obstacles to getting those insights?
Yeah, well, so fuzzy cognitive mapping is incredibly context specific. So, the results are based on the inputs that you put into the system, right? And we're not going out and measuring data. We're just kind of taking what the landowners knew about their property, about land management, and how it would be impacted. And so this was a little bit of a case study in just seeing how fuzzy cognitive mapping and structured decision making could work together. So I think the next biggest question is taking it for a lot of different natural resource problems and seeing if it's as successful or not as successful in a bunch of different contexts. I would think that would be the next step. In terms of hindrances, it's an easier model to use, but it still takes some training and time to get familiar with it. And so, that will always be a barrier with any model. That will always be a barrier. And while I think fuzzy cognitive mapping is pretty straightforward to learn, that it will still have that barrier.
Okay. And speaking of applying it in other contexts, do you think there were any lessons learned from your study that could be transferred to, for example, the devastating wildfires in Southern California that we had this year?
Oh yeah, that's a really great question. I think oftentimes the community isn't always involved in the answer. A lot of stakeholders aren't really involved in that whole decision-making process. And one thing that really stood out to me was how the different community members were really thankful and happy to be a part of the process and even excited. They really enjoyed being able to share the knowledge that they've gained from, the 20, 30 years that they've lived in that landscape and being able to apply it just in their small context. So I think in translating that to the LA fires, I think it speaks to it being critical to get the community involved in the process and don't let it be this, black box or thing behind the curtain that we then present the answer without really giving the community how we got there. And so I think having the community involved in every step of the way for any sort of research being done on those LA fires is really critical.
Okay. And one last question before we wrap it up. I saw that there were some people who represented state and local agencies within the Fire Hui group. So did any public policy officials participate in the study, or did it affect policy in any way?
Yeah, I know there was a representative of a congressman, a state congressman, I believe, that was involved in the Hui, and so that they were willing to participate as well. At this time, I'm not familiar with any sort of legislation or state policy being impacted, but I know that that's something that the Hui was really focused on, is how they could take their Hui and spread it across the state, and have it be impactful to beyond just Wai'nai.
Okay. Thank you. And any final comments or hopes for the future with regards to this work?
Yeah, I hope research like this can at least shed a little light onto how insightful communities are and how much knowledge is, just below the surface within these communities, and how that can actually be used for land management. And I hope, kind of along those same lines, that we can get a little bit more from the research that's not applied to research that is applied. And yeah, just moving from conservation research to conservation action. And I think that this study helps to demonstrate that that's certainly feasible and beneficial in a lot of different unique ways, that like community engagement can be very beneficial in ways that you might not initially expect.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your time and expertise today. And remember, to our audience, that science belongs to all of us.
Thanks for having me. It was great.